Well, I want to go now and invent. No, I don't want to invent him. Adam's already been invented. It's Adam Travi? Franti. Adam Franti. Adam Franti is a reenactor from Mackinac Island. If you've ever been to Mackinac Island and seen the soldiers dressed up in the olden times standing by the cannon that protects the fort, although they don't do a very good job, people keep getting in the fort. I've never heard the cannon go off. And he is a history student at Eastern Michigan University, and he's working on his master's degree in history, and a specialty that he's really interested in is the War of 1812. So Adam's going to tell us about our local involvement in the War of 1812, and with that, I'd like Adam to come up here and take over.
All right, folks, if you can't hear me, or if the voice isn't coming through the microphone, feel free to throw something with some force from the back row, and I'll be sure to speak louder. In any case, my interest in the War of 1812 mostly came from working at Mackinac. I happened to work there about a year before we started commemorating the bicentennial of the War of 1812, so we had quite a few pretty big events up there, culminated in 2014 with a big reenactment of the Battle of Mackinac Island on its 200th anniversary. That was fought on August of 1812 or 1814. And so I was actually lucky enough to participate in that. Of course, I was on the British side, the winning side. But we're going to talk a little bit about specifically kind of what Michigan did during the War of 1812. Now, Michigan at the time, when the war started, was a pretty small territory, but it had a couple of pretty important parts to it. So we got a map here. This is from about 1819. I know you probably can't see too much detail from way in the back, but basically there are two kind of major important areas. There's Detroit, obviously, and Mackinac Island. And Detroit and Mackinac Island were both fur trade posts. That was one of the big reasons that anybody ever bothered to live in Michigan in the first place, was all these lakes and rivers and everything actually acted as a great big highway. So all of the fur trade that was happening way in the west very easily could get through to Michigan from all the riverways up there, and from Michigan they could get to Albany in upstate New York. They could get to Ontario, even Quebec and Montreal, where they could be then shipped to Europe. So this was actually a major industry. As far back as even before the American Revolution, in the French and Indian War, Michilimackinac, which at the time was right up at the northern tip of the Lower Peninsula, was attacked by Native Americans who were displeased that the British had won the war and were trying to get their French allies back after that. They succeeded in capturing Michilimackinac, but they failed in their attempt to kind of oust the British from the Great Lakes region. So this is a contentious area in 1812. So that's one thing that we kind of have to get through our heads before we kind of start talking about the war. This was an important region. It seems like it's kind of, we're in the middle of nowhere now. We're kind of sort of in the Midwest. We're not quite East Coast. There's not really much to attack in Michigan anymore. Maybe 40 years ago they might have wanted to attack the auto industry, but so much for that. But so this was a critical area in terms of the fur trade and in terms of dealing with Native Americans as allies and as friends. So this was a pretty important region for there. So up here, obviously you see the map of Michigan. We've got two guys here. This is Major General Isaac Brock, who's obviously in the red uniform, a British general. He was very influential in the first couple of months of the war, obviously in terms of its impact on Michigan, we'll get to in a moment or two. And over here is William Hull. He was the governor of Michigan appointed by Thomas Jefferson in 1807, and so he's also a pretty important player in the first few months of the war. But we all know this guy. This is James Madison. James Madison was the president. He was our fourth president. He's the guy that actually declared war in the War of 1812. So how many of you actually thought the British were the aggressors? Be honest. Yeah, a few of us here and there. This was a war that we started. We, the Americans, in 1812 started. And they started for a number of reasons. There was a great deal of political disagreement about the war. This is actually, according to some historians, the most unpopular war in American history. That includes all of the wars in the 20th century, especially Vietnam and Korea, which were obviously not terribly popular wars. But some scholars, I don't know that much about it, but some scholars actually claim that this was the least popular war in American history, and a lot of that gets blamed on James Madison. But we've also got another guy, Thomas Jefferson. Madison, in many ways, kind of extended some of the policies that Thomas Jefferson championed. And if you want to blame any one person on the War of 1812, it's Thomas Jefferson, unfortunately. He gets kind of a black eye when we're dealing with how the war started and the politics leading up to the war. But I'm not going to bore you too much with the politics, so we'll get into more or less why it started. So this guy is another kind of major American figure. This is a very young William Henry Harrison. So this is before he became president, before he went up and gave that famous speech that maybe killed him and maybe not. But he was a general at the time. He was in charge of basically the Northwest Territories. The Northwest Territories kind of covered Michigan, parts of Ohio and Indiana, Wisconsin, and Illinois. At the time, he was the governor of the Indiana Territory. And he was, again, a fairly controversial figure. He was appointed by Thomas Jefferson, and he started off being very popular. A lot of people liked him at the start of his administration. He was not terribly popular by the time the war started, though, and that maybe led to some of the events that led up to the war. So one thing to note about kind of the Illinois Territory at the time was most of the people who lived there were not American citizens. They weren't even white people. They were Native Americans or Métis. Métis were mixed race people who generally were fathered by French fur traders on Native American mothers. So the Métis population was actually huge. That accounted for a great deal of the Michigan population around the first kind of couple of decades of the 19th century. And even into about the 1840s and 50s, the Métis population was actually still quite a bit bigger than all of the kind of registered American English white citizens that lived there. So a very important part of the Great Lakes region over here. In any case, Native Americans had a lot of problems with the United States. They supported the British during the American Revolution. When the British lost, they were pretty upset. That was actually the first time that they had tried to build what came to be called a pan-Indian movement. A pan-Indian movement was essentially a movement to try to unite all of the disparate Native American tribes in the Great Lakes region and even the entire continent into kind of one more or less hegemonous political entity. And it failed during the American Revolution. But the time around the early 19th century, a lot of Native Americans felt that it was time to try again. And so luckily they had some pretty charismatic leaders at the time that advanced that notion quite a bit. And Harrison was standing in the way of that pretty directly. So one of the interesting things about Harrison is one of the ways that his entire goal when he was appointed in 1800 was to get Indiana as its own state, not just a territory. He wanted it to be a state. So one of the things he did was import indentured servants, which is the term he used, because of the Northwest Compact, or anything north of a certain boundary line, it was illegal to have slaves. Harrison got around this by saying, if you bring your slaves from the South, they're not slaves anymore, but they're indentured servants for a period of 90 years or their death. So essentially, they're still unpaid, coerced labor, but they're technically not slaves. So it was okay. So you can see how this might be a little bit controversial, even to a lot of Americans at the time, who took the things like the Northwest Ordinance very seriously. In any case, he kind of passed under the radar for a few years and made quite a lot of strides toward advancing Indiana into statehood. But he followed the Jeffersonian Indian policy quite closely. And one of the ways that Jefferson sought to deal with Native Americans was to, obviously, we wanted to get land from them. The more land meant more cheap land that you could sell to prospective settlers. More population means a higher chance of statehood. So what they were doing, one of the things that they did is they'd go out and they'd find very influential Native American chiefs. And they'd say, well, you're going to represent the Odawa, and you're going to represent the Ojibwe, and we're just going to give you free stuff, basically. Just keep giving you free things, and we'll keep a note of everything that we give you. And later on, when it suits our needs, we're going to call those debts in. And one of the only ways that they could clear their debts, because they didn't have a lot of cash on hand, was to trade off land. And so if they got as many influential Native Americans as possible to trade away their land to deal with these debts, that was one of the ways that we could actually get quite a lot of land from the native people that lived there. So Harrison ended up getting about 90 million acres of land through means like this and some fair exchanges as well. But for the most part, again, it was pretty coercive. It was a very one-sided deal. And this was going on so much that, Native American people took notice. So the next person we have to talk to is this guy's name is Tenskwatawa. This was a name that he chose in about 1804. His earlier name was Lalawethika, which means he makes noise in the Shawnee language. So he was known as a drunk, as kind of a useless person. You can actually see in the painting here he's got kind of a droop in his eye, and that was from a fight that he got into with one of his friends when he was drunk, who hit him with a bottle, and it scratched up his eye. So he actually had that for the rest of his life. But at about 1804, he apparently he was drinking near a campfire. He passed out and apparently was visited by the Great Spirit. And the Great Spirit told him that the Native Americans were on the wrong path, that they were going down a path that would lead to their ruin. So he had this fundamental religious awakening, and he determined that he had to set the Native Americans straight. So he started preaching. And remember, this is a guy that nobody took seriously at all. And in about 6 months, we see letters from William Henry Harrison asking about who is this guy? Where did he come from? And this is dangerous. And so as early as 1804, the Americans actually have problems dealing with kind of a reinvigorated Native American population that aren't really going to take kindly to the kind of land claims that Harrison is making as he goes through. So he had the visit from the Great Spirit, and Tenskwatawa, the translation from that from Shawnee, is the open door. And so he felt that he was an open door for Native Americans to view the Great Spirit through his teachings and through his preachings. And now he is, up until about the 20th century, Tenskwatawa was considered the most important leader of the Native Americans of the time. He gets overshadowed a little bit in kind of modern times by his brother, whose name is Tecumseh. So who's heard of Tecumseh before? It was at Tecumseh, Michigan. You know, this is a pretty big deal. So Tecumseh was he was actually the younger brother of Tenskwatawa. His main name either means leaping panther or shooting star. So obviously, you know, he doesn't have a name like he makes noise. He was considered a pretty good hunter, pretty good leader. He was charismatic. You know, he was fit. He actually fought American troops at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. But he was a young warrior, and he actually loaded his musket wrong. He put the ball in before the powder, and then he fired one shot and then loaded it improperly and just ran away the rest of the time. So not a very auspicious beginning, but he was very early on part of this kind of continual efforts to get this kind of Native American pan-Indian confederacy going. And the War of 1812 was a big opportunity to try to get this there. So based on his brother's religious teachings, he started going around introducing other Native American tribes to his brother's teachings, to the prophet, as they started calling him. And this is, again, not the first time this has happened. And there's almost a network for things like this. Now, we don't think the Native Americans didn't have mail service. A lot of them didn't read. But he got around. He took a canoe. He went all the way down to places like Louisiana, almost as far as Florida. He was recruiting Creeks from the south there into this Pan-Indian Confederacy. And this was looking big and dangerous. So guys like Harrison are starting to notice. Now, unfortunately, what Harrison did was he assumed, which was a very common thought at the time, he assumed that no Indians could possibly be this charismatic. Nobody could possibly be this good at kind of stitching together these various tribes. If you imagine trying to make a single continuous country of all of the countries of Eastern Europe with their kind of contentious histories, different languages, different... there's more different languages in North American, Native American languages than there are in Europe. This is a vast and complex system of people with a lot of different kind of historical pressures. And he's uniting these people. And he's doing a really good job at it. And it's terrifying. But again, Harrison's looking at this and he's saying, well, this can't possibly be just two Shawnee brothers. There's no way. So who might be behind that, he thinks? And obviously the answer is the British. So again, by about 1806, 1807, we start seeing the prophet and Tecumseh referred to in Harrison and even Andrew Jackson's correspondence as an engine of the British. So really early on, we're blaming all of this on the British. We figure, well, they want, the Great Lakes. They want the fur trade. They want to come back and reconquer the United States. And of course, it's the farthest thing from their mind, because what's going on in about 1803 in Europe? It's the largest war in human history up to that point. This is the Napoleonic Wars. So they're very busy in fighting in Europe. And even back in 1794, after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, There's a moment where Americans are surrounding a British fort, and they actually had closed their doors to their Native American allies and refused to let them in on the basis that if they did, they might have to answer to Americans. They might have a shooting war in the United States. They don't want that, because in 1793, this is when the French Revolution is kind of just kicking into high gear, and they start attacking their neighbors. So the European conflicts are a major part of why the War of 1812 went the way it did. In any case, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa end up kind of gathering all these forces. They face off at a battle in 1811 called the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The Battle of Fallen Timbers, or Battle of Tippecanoe, sorry. Fallen Timbers was, again, about a decade earlier. So this marks kind of the beginning of the Indian War aspect of the War of 1812. And this is probably the most prominent part, the most important part for Michigan, because this includes an awful lot of Michigan natives. So the second in command for Tecumseh was actually an Odawa, who grew up around Ypsilanti. So he's, again, got a lot of allies up here, and Michigan becomes a pretty important part in the first couple of months of the war. But the Battle of Tippecanoe is, it's an attack on an American army that's coming toward a place called Prophetstown that was actually built kind of to thumb his nose at William Henry Harrison. It was actually built just east of the most recent treaty line that was signed by Harrison and a lot of other Native American tribes. Prophetstown was a deliberate attempt to kind of goad this type of reaction in. As American forces were sort of marching toward it, the Native Americans attacked, and they only withdrew because they had run out of ammunition in the middle of the night. There were, maybe a couple of dozen Native American casualties. There were not too many on the American side, but because the Americans held the field, they said, we definitely won. Nobody really believed that until William Henry Harrison started running for president about 20 years later and started kind of trumpeting up this victory as this major defeat of Native Americans. And if anything, all it did was united a lot of the Native Americans who weren't really sure which side they wanted to be on, till firmly that they're going to side with Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa against the United States. So this is, again, about 8 months or so before the war actually kicks off, but this is a pretty major reason. Again, all the Americans are seeing behind these Native American attacks are British. They're seeing British soldiers, they're seeing British arms and troops, British money, British trade goods, goading these Native Americans into attacking, because, again, they couldn't possibly do this on their own. But this kind of leads up to the war itself. So about 8 months later, again, the United States declares war on Great Britain. And they do this for, again, a number of reasons that have really nothing to do with Native Americans. At least that's the claim. So we have a couple of slogans that get formed pretty early on. So the first one is free trade and sailors' rights. Now this was because the pressures of the Napoleonic War meant that Great Britain needed as many men as possible in the Royal Navy. And the way that they went about getting men was a system called impressment, which was basically forced conscription. So if a Royal Navy officer walked in here and said, well, your name's John Smith, you're clearly a British citizen, you're coming with me, there's really nothing you could do about it. If you could show that you actually worked somewhere, they might let you off. If you could show that you maybe had an important cousin somewhere in the British government, maybe they'll let you go. But otherwise, they're looking for British citizens who are not doing anything, have no job, and they basically stick them on a ship and send them out to fight the French. The other way that they would go about doing this was, again, by sending around ships to stop other ships on the high seas and search them for Royal Navy or former Royal Navy crewmen, British citizens, and especially deserters. Deserters were a big part because, again, if your name is John Smith, there happen to be 117 John Smiths that deserted the Royal Navy 6 months before, they have your name on a list, they have your description. If you have a tattoo or a scar, anything that identifies you, they'll look at it and say, well, you match the description, again, you're coming with us. So the Americans start seeing this as an attack on our sovereignty. They're stopping American ships and they're searching them for British deserters. This can't possibly be fair. So we start making a whole lot of noise. It all comes to a head in 1807. It's called the Chesapeake Affair. The British kind of overstepped their bounds and they attacked an American warship. So this was considered a lot different than just stopping a merchant vessel on the high seas and searching it for Royal Navy deserters. But this time they stopped a warship. They actually fired on it and boarded it, and they found what they claimed were 6 Royal Navy deserters on board, and forcibly took them off and sailed away. So how do you think most Americans felt about this? Yeah, this is something that's beyond the pale. Even Federalists who were kind of not very in common with Thomas Jefferson at the time, even they were mad. And they started advocating a naval war. So these are all problems that we have because of the Royal Navy. So let's limit it to something like they did in the Quasi-War in the 1790s. We'll just limit it. We'll start getting letters of marque. We'll arm privateers. We'll go and attack British shipping. We'll solve this in about 6 months. The Jeffersonian Republicans, on the other hand, had totally different ideas. One of the other things was the Orders in Council. The Orders in Council were a British blockade of mainland Europe. Now, what country do you think had the largest merchant fleet in the North Atlantic at this point? It wasn't the French, and it wasn't the British. It was the Americans. Yeah, we made a lot of our money by trading with Europe. And the problem was, if we have to have a certain pass, essentially, to go trade with specifically British ports. If we don't have that, the British can board our ship, take our goods, and it's all legal. The problem is, we can also do that with the French. The French have a competing blockade, and so if we had a French pass, and we're found by the British with a French pass, they're going to take our ship, impound our crew, probably recruit half of them into the Royal Navy, and take the goods. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. We can either go with the French or with the British, and hope we don't run into either other ship on the high seas, because at that point, you can't really do anything about it. So, Orders in Council and impressment kind of made this made the pretty strong argument that we should probably have a naval war with Great Britain about this. But on the other hand, after the Chesapeake affair things died off, a lot of people were actually saying, well, why don't we go about this? We're going about this totally the wrong way. How about we ally ourselves with Great Britain? Then we can have basically a perfect contract. We'll get all sorts of great rates to trade with them, and it'll be great. We don't even need to go to war. But the problem was this was already kind of so advanced. We're already so irate at the British that was not really a political reality. But this is also complicated by the fact that the United States isn't just 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast anymore. We also have places like Kentucky, places like Indiana. So a lot of kind of this new wave of American politicians that grew up on the frontiers, and a lot of them were clamoring for war. A lot of them were using these excuses of Native Americans kind of rising up in the West, and the British backing them as saying, you know what, I bet we can invade Canada. And if we invade Canada, then we can have a great bargaining chip to deal with the British after we capture it. Now, what's the assumption here? The assumption is that it's going to be an easy thing to capture Canada. So even Thomas Jefferson, there's a letter that he wrote a couple of months before the war that said, the capture of Canada is a mere matter of marching. All we have to do is walk into the country and it's essentially ours. So why not we just go for it? So because of his influence and because a lot of this wasn't really questioned by at least the Republicans in office at the time, we figured, yeah, this is a good idea. We can probably do this. So we had this territorial ambition. We wanted to capture Canada. Kind of bets were up as to what we were going to do with Canada once we got it. The guys in the West wanted to annex it, keep it because why wouldn't we? Basically, people in New England said, well, if we do capture Canada, it's definitely just going to be a bargaining chip. We're just going to kind of trade it away to better trade rights and fewer restrictions. And then there were some people that said, well, I don't even know. I don't know what we're going to do. But territorial ambition was a big part of the war. Not everybody agreed with that aspect of it, but it's definitely an aspect of it that led to an aggressive war where the idea was that the Americans were going to capture territory for some purpose or another. We also had a pretty big indifference to Native American issues. We didn't really care. The only thing we wanted to make sure they didn't kind of confederate into one kind of big political entity, because that could actually hamper any efforts to expand westward, which is definitely what we wanted. And most people said, again, all we want to do is get the British influence out of the Northwest Territories so that we can expand freely out to the west. So it's a really complicated issue. I mean, this is not an easy war for anyone to go in. Even Thomas Jefferson had some reservations about going in, but the result was on June 18th of 1812, James Madison sent a declaration of war to Great Britain, and things got off to a very rocky start after that. So Isaac Brock is the guy who's in charge of Upper Canada. So Upper Canada, it's a little bit inverted. If you look at a map, Upper Canada is essentially Ontario. Lower Canada is actually farther to the east. And the way you kind of think about that is, imagine the St. Lawrence Seaway as the trunk of a tree. Once you get to the Great Lakes and all the rivers, those are the branches of a tree. So Upper Canada is the upper branches, just so you kind of know we're on the same page. So Isaac Brock is Lieutenant General at the time. He's kind of upset at being in Canada. Because again, the biggest war in human history is happening in Europe at the time, and Isaac Brock is the proud son of a proud family who's also under some really heavy debt at the time, and he figures his best way to get promotion, to get money, to advance in kind of the politics of the British at the time is to fight against Napoleon. That's where every soldier of talent is going. So he's kind of upset at being stuck in essentially a frontier backwater possibly defending against an American attack. He didn't really think too much of Americans. He didn't think too much at the time of Native Americans. He didn't want to be here at all. Luckily, for the Canadians at least, he actually knew what he was doing and did his job pretty well. He figured, again, the easiest way for him to get to fighting against Napoleon, the big leagues, is to do really well if it comes to a shooting war with the United States. So in 1810, he's appointed. This is, again, only about a year and a half before the war actually starts. And as soon as he gets here, he kind of hits the ground running. He starts recruiting Native American allies. He sends out fur traders to kind of talk about supporting the British if it comes to a war. He starts actually even talking with Americans in upper New York and kind of making almost trade alliances, which become pretty important later on. He's a very energetic officer. He's very efficient. He encourages a lot of his troops. It's actually one of the stories that I think kind of best encapsulates Isaac Brock as an officer. He had an officer under his command that was kind of a famous duelist. He would go on pretty much any slight. He would call somebody out, and they'd go out to the nearest nearby field, and they'd shoot at each other, because that's what you did. Isaac Brock found out about this and figured the best way to put a stop to it was to call this guy out. The guy accepted, because you can't really refuse when your commanding officer asks to duel you. And at that point, he said that the distance that they'd be shooting at was the length of a handkerchief, which means that one or both of them was definitely going to die. The guy backed off and didn't duel anybody again for apparently the rest of his commission. So this is the kind of guy he is. This is a very bold, enterprising. He's kind of every inch. If you've seen like the Master and Commander movie, he's like Jack Aubrey. He's this guy that just nobody can say no to. He's just full of vim and vigor. He's kind of every inch this typical British officer, and he's stuck here in Canada. Imagine that. So he reorganized Canada's plan of defense, because if you're looking at this war on paper, the Americans have somewhere in the order of about 100,000 to 300,000 militiamen that they can call up in an instant. That isn't really how it actually worked, but on paper, it's still pretty formidable. We have an army that's about 9,000 men strong. The Canadians have about 4,000 regular troops in Canada. They have vastly fewer men that they can call on to join the militia and repel invasions. So the biggest advantage that they have is if they get Native Americans on their side. Native Americans were considered a force multiplier. They make up for the fact that they have few numbers and the fact that they are terrifying. They're terrifying people to fight against. Americans have experience with it, and none of them want to fight against Native Americans. We'll actually see a lot of militiamen later on writing home saying like, well, I don't want to go into Canada because I don't want to fight any Indians. It's scary. So he reorganized these kind of volunteer regiments that they had. They called them fencible infantry, and he tried to get as many Native allies as possible. And this ends up making a really big difference once they get to Mackinac. So Mackinac Island, obviously, is up there in upper Michigan. This is actually a painting from about 1820 of Mackinac Island. So obviously up here is there's the commanding officer's quarters and cannon platform and everything. A little trade village down here. So it was actually a pretty important fort. I mean, not too many people live there. I mean, I think about 300 or 400 people live there year-round today. It's about the same number. But in the summer, you've got thousands of fur traders, thousands of Native Americans that come in, hang out for a couple of weeks, trade, and then leave. So it's this kind of thoroughfare for, again, trade. If you imagine the Great Lakes and all these rivers as highways, truckers are essentially making a pit stop at Mackinac Island. That's essentially what's happening here. So a lot of money is changing hands, and this makes it a valuable strategic target, not only for that, for cutting off essentially almost all of the Western territories from American ambition, but it also means that there's potentially they can capture quite a lot of goods if they happen to capture the fort. And Isaac Brock actually writes a couple of months before the war, if they can succeed in capturing Fort Mackinac and Fort Detroit in the early stages of the war, they will basically 100% have the Native Americans on their side. And that's a major strategic advantage because, again, they've got a vastly tiny army compared to the Americans. And they need is all the help that they can get. And Native Americans are a good thing to do. So the problem is there's a guy in charge at Fort Mackinac. He's an American soldier. He's about 25 years old. His name is Porter Hanks. Porter Hanks is technically the second in command at Fort Mackinac. And he's not really supposed to be there. Basically, he's sort of waiting either for a promotion to promote him to captain so he can actually be officially the commandant of the fort, or somebody to come in and replace him. So he's kind of stuck in this limbo, isn't really sure where his authority lies, and is really unsure of what to do. So when he starts hearing rumors from Native American translators and other fur traders that, hey, there's something going on, you might want to check with your government and see what's happening. He doesn't really know what to believe. The problem is, once Madison declared war, he sent the declaration of war to all these frontier posts by the mail. The mail service wasn't exactly what it is today. It wasn't very efficient. It didn't take a couple of days. It took several months for the declaration of war to get there. There's actually probably an apocryphal story about the guy who captured Fort Mackinac, the British officer who a couple of months later, they say, oh, there's this American messenger that came by, and he's got this packet, and the packet contained the letter that declared war on Great Britain. So this is actually embarrassing for the Americans. At the point, they didn't know war had been declared. British soldiers essentially got to the northern side of the island, the part that, again, you can see formidable guns on the harbor down here. They didn't have that on the northern side. So the British had recruited quite a lot of fur traders that lived on Mackinac Island. There was a guy who actually had a house. You can see where his house was. It was somewhere over here. He lived there, and he knew everybody on the island. He knew the whole thing by, like the back of his hand. He landed all these men on the northern side. They marched down, pointed a couple of cannons at the fort, and essentially demanded that Porter Hanks surrender. He, of course, was baffled. He woke up at about 7 in the morning when the surgeon who lived downtown ran up this whole huge ramp up the fort and, knocked on the commander's door and said, there are British soldiers on the island. They're clearing the civilians out of the town. So this is the first time that he knows that war has been declared. So he kind of gets up and looks out his back window, sees a number of British soldiers and an awful lot of Native Americans. So we know now that the number was about 40 redcoats. These are guys from the 10th Royal Veteran Battalion. These are men who are on average about 46 years old. The veteran battalions was something that Isaac Brock had actually created. And this was a way to kind of free up the younger, fitter troops for service, in important areas like York, like Quebec, like Montreal. And they figured frontier posts like Fort St. Joseph, which is about 40 miles or so northeast of Mackinac, they can be served by these older men who aren't really fit for frontline duty anymore. Lo and behold, these are the guys that actually win the first kind of action of the War of 1812. But they do it because they have about 500 Native American allies. They've got about 100 more Canadian volunteers that were doing the ones hauling the cannons up that great big hill behind the fort. So they don't even need to fire a shot. Porter Hanks kind of looks out, sizes up the situation, said there's absolutely no way that we can win. He's also worried because the British commander, kind of playing his hand pretty shrewdly, says that if you don't surrender right now, I think he says almost word for word, I cannot be held responsible for the effusion of blood, which must of necessity follow an attack of such troops as I have under my command. So the idea is he's saying basically like, if we have to attack, I'm not going to be able to control my Indian allies, and they will kill every single one of you. So Porter Hanks, again, young guy, kind of stuck in this impossible situation, surrenders without a fight, without a shot being fired. The British actually kind of swoop down into the town, capture a number of little fur trading vessels that are coming to give their goods to the fort. And just to kind of prove how big a victory this was, every single member of the 10th Royal Veteran Battalion received about 10 pounds sterling as prize money for capturing the fort. That's about 5 years of their pay. That was an enormous amount of money for a soldier. So this was a very important part. It was the July 17th. It was less than a month after war had been declared, and possibly our biggest fort north of Detroit had been captured without a shot fired. So not a very auspicious beginning. So now we get on to William Hull. So William Hull is the governor of the Michigan Territory. He was a Revolutionary War general. This is actually a painting of him from the Revolutionary War. This is kind of out of style by 1812. But he was considered a pretty good general during the Revolution. He's considered a hero of the Revolution. He was involved in some pretty major actions and was generally pretty well thought of. But more importantly, he was a Republican. He basically sided politically with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and so Thomas Jefferson made him the governor and the Indian agent of Michigan in 1805. And he did a pretty good job. But he was in his 60s when the war started, and he was not in very good health, and he also had his family up with him in the frontier. So he wasn't in a really great place to again be this kind of dashing, heroic figure like Isaac Brock. And unfortunately for Hull, that's exactly the guy he has to go up against. So one of the kind of big things he did was negotiate the Treaty of Detroit in 1807. This was one of the efforts to kind of stem this pan-Indian movement. It was basically saying like, well, we want a little bit of land, but we're going to get it fairly this time. That's not going to make anybody mad, right? So Hull, he did okay as a governor, but was not really very well suited to military command. And so once Brock kind of showed up, he was a little out of his league. So his responsibility, again, was right at the beginning of the war. He actually received notification that war had been declared before it was. He was kind of on the inside that way and started preparing for a Canadian invasion. So the big plan that the American government had at the time was this three-pronged attack. We figured, well, we've got the manpower, so we're just going to overwhelm the frontier defenses of Canada. We're going to capture their major cities. We're going to go up Lake Champlain. We're going to go across the Niagara River, and we're going to go across the Detroit River. And if we do all of that, we'll be able to kind of swamp the Canadian defenses. They don't have any men to stop all three of them, so we'll be able to march into Canada and capture it very, very easily. Obviously, that doesn't happen because this is a map of the Detroit River up here, so it's not really, well, it is facing north. So you can see Fort Detroit is way up here, and this whole kind of waterway down here. Guess who goes across the river fairly easily? Native Americans. They go across all the time. They can carry their canoes with them, so it's not really a big problem at all. So Hull's starting to have trouble. Once he gets his troops up to Fort Detroit, he gets Ohio militia to go up there with him. He gets all sorts of other embodied troops. The problem is supply. In order to march this great big army, he's got about 2,000 men at the start of his invasion. They actually had to cut a road going all the way up here, all the way to Fort Detroit. The problem with that is it's one very small road. Everything else they have to rely on river transportation. And the problem is the British actually have a bigger kind of presence on the Great Lakes than the Americans do. So it's very tricky to actually get supplies up to Fort Detroit. So he figures we're going to give it some time, collect as many resources as possible, and then we're going to launch right across the Detroit River, capture Sandwich, and head down to a fort down here called Amherstburg, or Fort Malden at Amherstburg. And if they can do that, basically this entire kind of left wing of right wing, I guess, of the Canadians is going to be completely swamped, and we'll be able to march toward Toronto, march up in the direction of Montreal and Quebec, and again, we'll be able to succeed. Obviously, Tecumseh is standing right in the way of there. So Tecumseh starts sitting on this road, basically. He's got several hundred kind of coming and going warriors, and every time they see a supply shipment going up to Fort Detroit, they attack it. And they're doing very, very, very well. So they usually sit at a place called Brownstown or Monroe, Frenchtown, and they're attacking these convoys that are coming up for resources very successfully. Hull, kind of increasingly panicky, is sending more and more reinforcements down to protect these trade convoys, and they mostly fail. There's actually quite a few pretty bad actions where Americans get pretty badly cut up. One of the biggest things that happens, though, is by about the time Hull got here, he figured, you know what, it's probably better if we can put most of our heavy equipment and our baggage. This includes a lot of gunpowder, some cannons, heavy equipment that the soldiers don't want to carry. We'll load those onto boats. We'll let the boats kind of bob up to Fort Detroit that way, and they can offload the heavy equipment, and it'll make everything easier. The problem was, he thought that the British hadn't been warned about the war breaking out, so he figured this ship can just sneak on through. They'll be none the wiser. The problem was, like, the day that the ship went by, it's called the Cuyahoga. The day that the Cuyahoga is floating by Fort Amherstburg, the British had actually received notification that war had been declared, and they said, is that an American ship? Go out and get it. So they actually rowed some canoes out, stopped the ship, captured everything, and this included a lot of William Hull's personal stuff. So remember, he's bringing his family with him. So when he has to tell his wife and his kids, like, well, sorry, I don't have the bedding that I promised you, he starts writing these very drippingly polite letters to the commander at Fort Malden, asking for his stuff back. And it's actually hilarious to read these scrupulously polite responses going back and forth between these two guys, and it's almost absurd. But this is kind of a goofy war. So, so in any case, a couple of Odawa or Ojibwe Native Americans come down and actually tell Hull, "Hey, Fort Mackinac has been captured." At that point, Hull is actually sitting in Sandwich, which is just across the river from Fort Detroit. He had started his invasion in early July. This is before Mackinac had ever actually been captured. And one of the first things he did was send a proclamation to all the Canadian citizens over there saying, essentially, like, our war is not with you, we're coming as liberators, and also we're going to kill you if we find you fighting with Indians, so don't do that. So it sends this really conflicting message, and according to Hull, the letters he's sending back to the Secretary of War, it's totally working, and all of the Canadian militia are fleeing in front of this American advance. The reality is, again, he gets to Sandwich, which is modern-day Windsor, and he sits there. He just waits. because, again, he doesn't really have the supplies that he needs. He's waiting on news of what's happening. He wants basically the American army to invade across Niagara to split the Canadian defenses so that he can continue to Fort Malden and then move on. And that doesn't happen because Isaac Brock is very busily kind of working his way and trying to get command of everybody in Canada. And he ends up getting it pretty well organized. And by about early June or early July, he starts sending his men farther to the west to go challenge this American invasion. The problem is, as soon as William Hull hears about Fort Mackinac surrendering, he fires off a letter that actually says, the northern hive of Indians has been turned loose upon the frontier. So he's terrified that suddenly thousands of Native Americans who were formerly nice and peaceful have been stirred up by this British attack. They've been stirred up by the fact that they're being promised all these prizes and goods from the British, and they're just going to swoop down onto Fort Detroit and kill everybody. And again, this is a pretty legitimate fear. Indian massacres did happen. They actually happened very close to Fort Detroit. There's a Fort Dearborn in Chicago was actually the victim of a massacre at the very beginning of the War of 1812, about 10 days or so before Fort Detroit surrenders. So this is a very real fear. So a lot of writers, especially at the time, castigate Holt, say that he was an incompetent and he was cowardly and he was completely unfit for command. And this is just a man under enormous pressure. This is a hard situation to be in. He's getting virtually no support from Congress, no support from the American government, none of the supplies that he was promised, and most of the men are on very short-term militia contracts, and a lot of them can legally say they don't have to go into Canada if they don't want to. They actually have to be very, very careful with this and actually get volunteers to serve with them, because William Hull cannot order the militia to cross the border. That's not the militia's role. So he actually has to ask them, will you please come with me into Canada? So this is a problem later on for a lot of other American commanders. Hull, unfortunately, just doesn't really deal well with all of this. So the British eventually kind of cross over. They cross over up north of Hog Island. They set up a battery here. They set up a battery here and start firing on Fort Detroit on August 14th. It takes 2 days, and finally William Hull surrenders. Again, another possibly apocryphal story. Reinforcements from Ohio and Indiana are actually only a couple of hours away, and they apparently come right over this hill and they see the American flag being pulled down and the British Union Jack going up, and they throw down their muskets in disgust and they leave. So it's probably a made-up story just to sensationalize things for the newspapers, but that kind of is the spirit of what happened when Fort Detroit surrendered. Remember, this is August 16th. We declared war on June 18th. This is less than 2 months after the war started. We lost our two most prominent Great Lakes forts like that. You know, barely a shot fired, almost no resistance offered. This is a bad news for the Americans. So almost very quickly, William Henry Harrison stirs up some Kentucky volunteers, starts marching back up, and he wants to recapture Detroit before the winter sets in. And this also ends badly because he gets to, this is a painting of Brock striding into Fort Detroit. Now, one thing I want to point out before I kind of get into the battles of Frenchtown and everything is if you can see it here, most of the paintings that show Isaac Brock show this very interesting sash that he's wearing. Now, he probably wouldn't have been wearing that sash when he actually received the surrender at Fort Detroit, but Brock and Tecumseh kind of got along famously as soon as they met each other. There's a lot of kind of very entertaining stories about Tecumseh. He doesn't speak English, but he meets Brock for the first time, and through their translators, they're having this very nice conversation. And basically, Tecumseh, apparently when he turns around and walks away, he mentions to one of his colleagues that's with him, and he says, "That's a man." So he really likes him. And Isaac Brock, similarly, is complimentary to everybody that he can tell that Tecumseh he's definitely the guy that we want on our side. So they start this very kind of famous friendship, and one of the gifts that Brock received from Tecumseh when they first met was this very colorful sash. So most British officers would have worn a very bright scarlet sash, and that was just a mark of rank. So you'd see even lieutenants and junior officers would wear a scarlet sash. And so in most of the paintings that you see Isaac Brock, he's wearing this very colorful Indian weaved sash, and this is just kind of to reinforce this friendship that Brock had with the Native Americans. So he turns almost completely 180 in his opinion of Native Americans as allies once he meets Tecumseh. So this is, again, kind of this powerful friendship is a big story. If you talk to anybody from Canada about the War of 1812, they can probably talk your ear off about Brock and Tecumseh, because they're heroes on the same scale that, you know, we look at guys like George Washington over here. So he's a pretty important figure now in Canadian folklore. In any case, so he receives the surrender very quickly, and within a couple of months, unfortunately, that's Isaac Brock, again, his Indian sash, dying in October of 1812 at the Battle of Queenston Heights. So this was the second attempt by Americans to invade Canada. It ended in failure, and according to most of the sources, the reason was the American militia refused to cross the border into Canada, and this is because they were all vile Federalists and they opposed the war. And again, when you look at the kind of dispatches from the front line and everything, it's mostly because, again, they have no supplies. Most of them don't have shoes. Some of them don't have blankets. There's one militia commander that says, like, we didn't have 3 shots to a man when they were asking us to go across. And furthermore, all the boatmen took off. So we didn't even have a way to get across if we wanted to. So this is kind of the first big American victory. This is just a couple of months before Harrison actually gets up to the Michigan territory once again. And is trying to oust.
And where did this battle take place?
This was Queenston Heights is just across the Niagara River. So this is the second attempt to come across again from the second kind of wing of this 3-pronged invasion. This is October of 1812. So after that, unfortunately, I've got a whole lot written down here. So Isaac Brock is killed. British leadership is compromised, and a lot of people think this might be the end of the Native Alliance because so much of it was riding on the shoulders of Tecumseh and Isaac Brock's friendship. Unfortunately, the guy that took over from Brock is named Henry Proctor. Proctor, for the most part, is all right in dealing with Native Americans. He doesn't really have the charm or charisma that Isaac Brock had, but he's actually able to convince Tecumseh to stick around at least for a little while. And his efforts actually pay off. So a few months later, William Henry Harrison tries to come back up and recapture Detroit. And he's pushing even into the winter. And if you study 19th century military stuff, this doesn't happen very often for pretty good reason. It's a bad idea to go marching off to war in the middle of winter. Again, these guys are wearing wool, which is actually a much more comfortable fabric than you might think. But the problem is it rots away very quickly. So you've got guys who are fighting at the battles of Frenchtown who might not have shoes on. Their trousers might have been shredded away. There's actually a lot of reports, again, from junior officers and stuff when they get in control of a new fort or a new post. First thing they write about is we need more uniforms. A lot of times they'll say, the men showed up literally naked. They had nothing, not a stitch to wear. And of course, this is exaggerating, saying if you're wearing a shirt and without a waistcoat, you're basically naked at the time. That was kind of what they considered it. In any case, so at first the Americans kind of push the British out of Frenchtown. Again, this is Monroe, Michigan, today. And then Proctor, a couple of days later, counterattacks. So he comes in and he's actually got tiny little 3-pound cannons that are probably no taller than this podium here on skis. He has them on sleds. And they're pulling them across the ice and they're firing on the American line, and they end up pushing them out and capturing Frenchtown. Now the problem is Proctor isn't as bold as Isaac Brock was. And Isaac Brock, when he was actually outnumbered pretty severely, captured Fort Detroit from a superior force just on kind of the force of his own inertia. Proctor is much more careful. So once he pushes the Americans out of Frenchtown, he kind of looks about the situation. He's getting reports from a lot of his scouts and spies that William Henry Harrison's army, this was actually just a small part of it, was only about 10 miles behind them, maybe a day's march in the winter away. So he decides, I don't want to get caught out in literally the open up here. I want to get back to Fort Detroit. So he takes most of his men, as many of the wounded American prisoners as he could get, and starts marching back to Detroit. And this lets the Native Americans who were down there basically let loose on the American prisoners. Now, there's a lot of social factors in these Native American massacres. It wasn't because, if you read 19th century American sources or British sources, that these were just bloodthirsty savages. They have a lot of religious beliefs that revolve around putting to rest your relative spirits, basically. So let's say, my brother was killed by an American soldier. The only way that I can set his spirit to rest is by killing an American soldier. A lot of the way they do this is through ritual torture. So this is, pretty gruesome stuff, and a lot of it was exacerbated by the fact that Proctor didn't take a lot of alcohol with him. There's, the whole town was basically laid through with alcohol, so the native warriors got drunk and went through dragging wounded soldiers out of houses and butchering them, essentially. So this kind of stains this victory a little bit. This is a pretty major victory for the British, but the problem is they can't really end on a good note here. And the British are looking for any excuse whatsoever to end the war. Again, they don't want to fight this war. They want to concentrate as much as possible in Europe. So they want to get this down as fast as possible. There's absolutely no way that they can end the war after the battle at Frenchtown because of this Indian massacre. So this is where we get that second slogan that you saw earlier, remember the raisin. So this is something that really motivates a lot of otherwise recalcitrant soldiers to join up and go fight for revenge. It's not really that different from the way the Native Americans are looking at things. If, your son or cousin or nephew gets killed by an Indian, you go out and kill an Indian. So, a lot of bad blood between the two sides here. Remember the raisin. That's where we get that. So the rest of the next year or so, at least in terms of Michigan, is pretty uneventful. Not a whole lot happens. The British kind of happily sit at Fort Detroit. They're trying to get as much as possible done. There's actually lots of very interesting stories between both sides trying to control the Great Lakes. Both of them are trying to essentially build ships from scratch. And this would be, let's throw an aviation engineer out in the middle of nowhere with no machine tools, no parts, no skilled workers, and say, you make a fleet of airplanes for us, fighter jets for us. We need to control the airspace above Nebraska in 2 months. This is the kind of level of complexity that's happening here. And they've got engineers building round the clock, trying to build ship after ship after ship to control the Great Lakes. And for the most part, they actually do a tremendous job. By the time the Battle of Lake Erie actually happens, there's about 18 ships on both sides that are fighting. There's a huge number of ships built on short notice with very little equipment. Like up until the day of the battle, both sides are desperately asking their governments to send rope because they just need as much as possible. Again, building a ship requires an awful lot of industry, and up in northern Pennsylvania and southern Ontario, there just wasn't any industry. So it's a pretty incredible story. But in any case, we try to invade Canada a second time at Queenston Heights. It fails. But after this shipbuilding battle, we finally do have a battle in September of 1813. It's the Battle of Lake Erie. It's a pretty convincing American victory. You've probably all heard of Oliver Hazard Perry and his famous speech, or famous kind of letter he fires off as soon as he wins the battle. We have met the enemy and they are ours. He lists all the ships that he captured from the British fleet there. So this actually allows, as soon as before the battle started, the British had actually retreated back across the Detroit River because Fort Malden was considered more defensible than Fort Detroit. So they took as much as they could from Detroit, went back down to Malden, and Harrison and his troops moved back up. He's got about 3,000 or so men now at Fort Detroit, just waiting for this battle to end, because whoever controls Lake Erie can go back and forth across the Detroit River with impunity. And this kind of launches the third or so invasion of Canada from the western area. So the British had first gone down to Fort Meigs, which is in Indiana. It's actually not too far from here. That's a failure. The Indians and the British besiege Fort Meigs for quite a while, and they're not able to capture it. There's a couple of engineers actually who are kind of heroes at Fort Meigs. Yes, sir? Fort Meigs, Perrysburg, Ohio. I believe so. Yeah, yes, it was at Perrysburg, Ohio, correct? Yeah. Yes, sir.
One of them ships right there that you hear about, they found down the bottom of the...
Yeah, I just heard that. He asked if...
they got the cannon off of it.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a naval archaeology had actually just recently found a remnant of the Battle of Lake Erie, apparently. So, pretty big news. Yeah, so quite a few ships that actually were sunk. Most of the American ships were battered to beyond recognition at the point. This is one of those kind of battles where I don't particularly believe in Providence as kind of a means of historical change, but every single thing that could have gone well for the Americans went well, to a dramatically fine line. There's a letter again from Perry basically saying whether or not he's considering attacking on September 10th because the wind is actually against him. The Americans, all their ships are armed with carronades, which are powerful cannons, but they're very short range. And most of the British ships have long guns, so they can fire at great long range pretty accurately. And so if the wind was against the American fleet, they could just sit back and fire at long range and just decimate the Americans before they could get up. But just in the nick of time, the wind changes direction and gets fully behind the American fleet, and they're able to sail in and, of course, beat the British. It's a very close-run thing, though. It's by no means a huge victory. There really no ships are actually capable of sailing after the battle for a couple of months. They have to go get fixed up, and again, they have no ropes. So it takes a long time for them to actually get anything ready to go. But this does allow William Henry Harrison to cross the Detroit River. And in October 1813, this is almost exactly a year after Isaac Brock had been killed. Tecumseh is actually killed at the Battle of Moravian Town in Ontario. So Tecumseh's death, according to kind of most of the standard history, kind of ends this Native American Confederacy. In reality, there's still quite a lot of very charismatic leaders, including a lot of Odawa native to Michigan, that are supporting the British, even after Tecumseh is killed. So it's not something that just sweeps the field of Native American allies, but the British, even at that point, are growing more reticent to use them because of the scars as a result of the legacy of the Battle of Frenchtown, the River Raisin Massacre. So it's a much less powerful Native American Confederacy, but it's still something that is extremely useful to the British. It's still something that up until the signing of the treaty that ends the war, the British and the natives still believe that they have a pretty good working relationship. A lot of the junior officers up to about colonel, there's a guy named Robert McDowell we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, was, again, a firm supporter of Native American auxiliary troops and was very angry that he had to give up the territory that he had successfully defended here in Michigan. So Tecumseh killed. This is a couple of paintings of the death of Tecumseh here. If you believe some of the stories, this is Richard Mentor Johnson, who later becomes the vice president of the United States. The legacy of the War of 1812 is almost as important as the war itself. A lot of politicians are made essentially from the legacy of this war, including William Henry Harrison, Richard Mentor Johnson, John Calhoun, Henry Clay. All of these guys are pretty influential in the War of 1812, and a lot of them have very long political careers almost as a direct result of their actions in the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson, obviously, as well. Not so much up here in Michigan, but down south, he's pretty important. So yeah, just a couple of different depictions of his death here. It's obviously very important. Now this is actually, if any of you have been up to the art museum up there on Mackinac Island, this was a commissioned painting of the Battle of Mackinac Island. So again, happens in August of 1814. Those are British regulars up here lining up their cannons and everything. You can see little blue American guys running back and forth between cover over there. And actually the American fleet got patched up and came back up. So unfortunately for the Americans, this is an absolute disaster. So after they control the lakes, they decide, well, we need to go up and capture Michigan, or capture Mackinac again. The biggest reason was, once again, they can try to sever this connection between the British forces and their native allies. They figure if they're going to come up to Mackinac to get their treaty payouts and everything, they're going to get them from us rather than the British. So we want to make sure that we can control the political spin of the future of the war. And they also want to control the island at the end of the war. Because again, both sides at this point are desperately trying to end it. And they're desperately, all the guys who are off in Ghent trying to end the war are waiting for these dispatches that are coming back across saying, well, the Americans won a battle, so we can definitely go to the British now and say, you better end the war, it's going to be a disaster. The British are doing the exact same thing. As soon as there's a British victory, they're going to the Americans and saying, stop embarrassing yourselves, just end the war. So both sides are kind of waiting for this kind of clincher, right? And it never really comes. And the campaign for Mackinac is unfortunately a giant disaster. Almost from the beginning, there are supply problems. Men are sick. There's not enough food for them. The boats don't have enough equipment or enough sailors. So it takes them almost a month to sail basically from Detroit up to Mackinac. Now you can do that in a boat in about 2 days. You can do it probably in 1 day. I've never actually sailed that far, but it's pretty quick if you've got a ship that's actually weatherly and sailable. Unfortunately, most of the ships weren't. They were still being plugging cannon holes with canvas and whatnot. So they're not in good shape. They're leaky. This is exacerbating all the sickness that all the men it's crammed down in the holds are feeling. These are pretty small they're not even ships. They're brigs, 2 masts at most. So there's not a whole lot of room for men on there. I don't know if anybody's ever been on the Niagara, the reconstruction ship. If you go down to the deck, the deck that everybody sleeps on, it's about this high. So that's where most of the men are crammed for 24 hours a day for a couple of months as they're trying to sail up to capture Fort Mackinac. So you can imagine once they actually get on Mackinac Island, they're not in great shape. So it's always nice to see paintings like this where everybody's got this picture-perfect uniform. Everything's very clean. All their equipment's there. There's not big holes or patches or sweat stains or rotted wool. And most of the time, if we were to travel back in time to see that, most of the guys on both sides are probably like, maybe they have a shirt that they painted red, to match everybody else. It's not something that looks this brilliant all the time. But for some reason, people just don't want to paint that. I don't know why. But the British commander is a guy named Robert McDowell. So he's a part of the Glengarry Light Infantry Fencibles. He's actually, you can see it better in the unfaded version, but he's this guy here. He's wearing this great big brilliant green hussar's coat. And hussar's coat, imagine the flashiest marching band uniform you've ever seen. Dark green, buttons, rows of 3 buttons going all the way up down the front. And he's wearing a fur pelisse over his left shoulder. And this is probably the most dashing, like 19th century military uniform you can imagine. So he's kind of dressed to the nines on this day of battle here. But so he's a guy kind of out of the mold of Isaac Brock. He's a guy that people like to follow. He's very effective, and he's a good leader. And he wins the Battle of Mackinac Island, even though he's outnumbered. The Americans actually have a big advantage of movement. They can put their troops on ships and they can sail them all around the island. So he basically has left the Fort Mackinac, completely undefended. Most of the 10th Royal Veteran guys that actually captured the fort have either been posted elsewhere, or there may be 2-3 guys that can man a cannon left at the fort. Everybody else is out there fighting. And again, another critical component are the Native Americans. You can see down here. Actually repulsed with quite a few casualties, an American effort to outflank the British left flank. They sent a charge basically across this field over here. There are Native Americans hiding in the woods who fire 2 or 3 volleys. It kills the American commander instantly. His name is actually Andrew Hunter Holmes. And if you go up to Fort Mackinac today, there's Fort Holmes. The highest point on the island is actually named after Andrew Hunter Holmes, who was killed at this battle. So it's a battle that has a pretty short firing range. They fire artillery at each other for several hours and nobody hits anybody. But you can actually see somewhat up here. If you were to go to the golf course up on Mackinac Island, the Wawashkamo golf course is actually where we did the reenactment, was right on the footsteps of the battle. There's a little ridge. It's maybe about 6 feet high. But if you were just to station troops right on the edge of the ridge, they'd be totally open for artillery fire. But if you were to put them about 10 feet back from that ridge, there's not a single cannonball that you can fire from anywhere on the north side of that will hit them. The balls will hit the hill and bounce over, and they're perfectly safe. So they fire artillery at each other for about 4 hours. Nobody hits anything. And eventually the Americans say, well, we have to try to push the British back, or we have to leave, one or the other. So they make this advance. It gets repelled. They go back to their ships, and they sail away. So unfortunately, it's pretty bad for the Americans. They're not able to recapture the fort. They end up going back to their ships, and they actually sail over to Fort St. Joseph and burn Fort St. Joseph to the ground. And they go around to a few other places and attempt to starve out the British from Mackinac Island. They actually sail over to the Nottawasaga River, which is where most of the canoes loaded with trade goods and food and supplies are going from to Mackinac Island. And they sit there and blockade it with 2 ships, the Tigress and the Scorpion, or 2 brigs. I guess sloops of war. But anyway, they sit these 2 ships over at the mouth of the river. And the commander essentially says, continue moving, because we don't want somebody to come out and just capture the ships. You keep moving, stay in contact with each other. That way, if one of the ships gets captured, you can see it and not get tricked. What happens is they set anchor, they sit there, don't listen to their commands, and a very enterprising young commander from Mackinac heads out on canoes with a lot of Indian warriors and volunteer Canadians and captures the Tigress. He does it without a shot being fired, just going over the side with like bayonets and hatchets and swords. Captures the ship, stuffs all the Americans into the hold, and then finds the signal book, because the ship had been captured so quickly that the commander couldn't even hurl the signal book over the side. Uses that to get the coded signals to send to the Scorpion the next day, and the Scorpion just says, hey, what's going on? It sails over to meet up, and they capture that ship too. So again, the War of 1812 on the Upper Great Lakes is kind of a comedy of errors, at least on the American side. It's something that, again, defeat after defeat after defeat, and we just keep on trying and just can't get anything going. And a lot of that is, again, because we're so far out on the frontier, and we don't think about Michigan as being the frontier, but we're so far out that supplies are very hard to come by. Both the Americans and the British and their kind of tenure on Mackinac Island have supply problems all the time. And it's just something that they can never really effectively deal with as they go. So the battle was on August 4th, 1814, British victory, and the British are able to hold Mackinac Island until the end of the war. So this is one of the actually one of the kind of unremarkable aspects of the end of the war, there are two great, big, huge victories that the Americans have in the last couple of months of the war. And these are, again, these clinchers that we have that end the war favorably for the Americans. So we retreat from Canada, and the British start getting this great big attack force ready to come down Lake Champlain. If you've read any history of like the Revolutionary War and even the French and Indian War, the Lake Champlain corridor, they call it, is army heaven. You can go up, you can be supplied from the lake, you can march basically straight up to Montreal, and you can do it really quickly and very effectively. And this is what the British are trying to do. They tried to do it at Saratoga, that ended in Saratoga in the Revolution, and this is what they're trying to do again. So while they're getting ready for that, the British have finally gotten their naval actions under control. And one of the positive aspects from the American point of view is the naval war. We actually do quite well in the naval war in the first few months of the war, but eventually the British just overwhelm us. The problem is we have about 18 ships at the beginning of the war. The British have well over 1,000 warships, and not all ships, but war boats, I guess. But they have the largest navy in the world. They're fighting a war against the second largest navy in the entire world, and a few frigates here and there aren't really going to do all that much. So there's a few famous victories of American heavy frigates against British frigates, and most of the single ship actions end successfully for the Americans. But eventually they're just overwhelmed. The British blockade most of the American ports, and they start sending raids up and down the Chesapeake. And one of the reasons they picked the South is because that's where a lot of the money comes from, a lot of the influence comes from, and that's where a lot of the support from the war actually comes from. If they had been raiding up and down the New England coast, a lot of the Federalists up there who are against the war to begin with might start seeing the British as bad guys rather than kind of a political ally at the time. So they aim for the South. They're going on raids of plantations. They're freeing slaves, and this is getting a lot of Southerners very upset because this is an existential attack on their way of life, basically. But this kind of culminates in August 24th of 1814. The British actually captured Washington City, and they burned it to the ground. And this is after probably the most embarrassing American defeat of the war, probably of the century, probably of American history, the Battle of Bladensburg. The Battle of Bladensburg, again, a much smaller British contingent basically kicked off the American, mostly militia, from a hill, and they did it by crossing a bridge, essentially. And this is when, you see the bright blue coat over there. The British obviously are wearing very bright red coats when they can afford to. They crossed a bridge that was under heavy artillery fire, and they stayed in formation. And hundreds of men were being hit by cannonballs, and they just kept on marching in good order, formed up on the other side. Most of the militia, when they saw that, just threw down their muskets and ran away. So the British started calling them the Bladensburg races. And from what I hear, apparently they have a festival every summer where they run the Bladensburg foot race. And so it's a little cheeky now, but one of the most embarrassing chapters in American military history. And that leads to the British burning Washington City to the ground. But the largest land invasion of the United States is being organized while this is all happening. Several thousand, this is one of the biggest armies that's assembled during the war. And these, when you look at the Napoleonic Wars, you see armies of 70, 80, 90,000 men on one side, fighting an army of possibly bigger, hundreds of thousands of men engaged fighting each other at once. You look at something like the Battle of Waterloo. And then you look at something like the Battle of Plattsburgh, which maybe has 3,000 or 4,000 men engaged at any time. And they seem really small. And one of the reasons for that is because Europe actually has an infrastructure for this kind of thing. North America doesn't. Again, when you're trying to build ships with ropes that you're making at the same time, it's really difficult. So smaller troop numbers don't necessarily mean the battles are any less important, though. On September 11th, 1814, the British are again trying to control Lake Champlain. There's another naval battle, and this is again where most of the Americans have their successes, and they beat the British. Again, it's a very interesting battle if you manage to look into it. The American commander had sprung up a couple of, they called them springs, on their anchors, which allowed his ship to basically yaw around when he needed to. So he fired his broadsides until that side of the ship was completely beaten to a pulp, hit the spring and sprung around, and then started firing broadsides from the other side. And in any case, they won the naval battle. The land battle never happened, and the British Army basically retreats in disarray at this point. And now, aside from kind of the high profile of the Battle of New Orleans, this is probably the most important battle of the war. If they had succeeded in getting past Plattsburgh, they had a straight shot to basically all of the northern states. They could have marched anywhere in the continent that they wanted to, virtually unopposed. Again, you've got guys who fought the Battle of Bladensburg standing in their way, so they're probably just going to throw their muskets down and run away again. So they're not really terribly concerned, but they're stopped at Plattsburgh, and this probably saves the United States from a very embarrassing failure. But by December, actually the Peace of Christmas Eve, they called it. The peace is actually signed on Christmas Eve in 1814, and largely this is because we actually kind of sent some pretty good ambassadors over to negotiate the Treaty of Ghent. We had John Quincy Adams, who's known as probably one of the most kind of formidable diplomats that we've ever had as a country. We have John Henry Clay, who's one of the guys that actually started the war. He's one of the war hawks that kind of starts chanting Canada right at the beginning of the war. As soon as he sees the embarrassing failures that we're taking, he's like, oh, well, that was a bad idea. We should probably stop this. And so they send Henry Clay over as well. And then we send Albert Gallatin, who is Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury. So we have pretty heavy hitters going over to Ghent to negotiate for our side. And I mean, do you think that the British feel that the War of 1812 is more important, or the Napoleonic Wars are more important? It's a no-brainer. So they have guys who are like the secretaries of the guys who are negotiating the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and so you have to wait all the time to send queries back to London to ask what should we do. The Americans have a new proposal, and it's largely because of the influence of the Battle of Plattsburgh, this great, big, huge, unambiguous American victory, probably the first one of the entire war, that the American diplomats are able to actually argue the British down into ending the war. So no side won. This was a very political end to the war, but it's all overshadowed by the fact that a couple of weeks after they sign the treaty that ends the war, we have this great, big, huge battle at New Orleans. We have pop country songs written about. We have movies made about. This is a really kind of huge, influential battle. If I ask anybody about the War of 1812 and what they know about it, half the time people would say, oh, well, the Battle of New Orleans. Even though it meant absolutely nothing to the end of the war. It had already been over, but this is a big kind of pop culture victory, essentially. This is something that we can kind of unambiguously say, yeah, we won the war. So if you imagine living in some place like Baltimore when the war was ending, not only has Plattsburgh, which happened essentially in your backyard, just ended successfully for Americans. At Baltimore, that's where the attack at Fort McHenry and famous song is written about it. Some of you may have heard. And that's happening at Baltimore. They successfully repel a British attack at Baltimore. And then we have this great big victory at New Orleans, and you start thinking, well, maybe we did win the war. And all the newspaper guys, everybody in the government is happy to say, yes, we totally did. We definitely won. Don't say anything else. We definitely won the war. When in reality, it was a very tightly negotiated truce that only worked because of some news arriving at a very specific time. So this is actually a painting commemorating the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. So you can see all of our American politicians standing there, British officers signing everything. But obviously the British, again, more concerned about dealing with this mess in Europe than they are about North America. But this does actually represent the very last time that Native Americans are ever represented in European politics, ever again. And if there's one legacy of the War of 1812 that's more important than any of the others, it's exactly this. It's the idea that the British, the French, the Germans, whoever wants to, is not really able to interfere within American hegemony anymore. And this is kind of one of the things that we wanted. Again, we wanted to sever the connection between the British and the Native Americans on this continent, and the war effectively does that. The British are no longer interested in fighting in North America. It's too expensive. They consider it a waste of time. They don't like fighting Americans because they just think we're kind of misled cousins rather than actually true enemies. The French are the enemies. So they don't want to fight us anymore. So they basically kind of bow out of American politics. And this is later on followed up by the Native American Confederation, obviously with the death of Tecumseh and their abandonment by the British essentially collapses the Confederation. There are times later on when Native Americans attempt to confederate again and oppose the power of the United States government again. It happens in the South with the Seminoles, although that's not nearly as far-reaching as the Confederacy was in 1812. It happens in Illinois with the Black Hawk Rebellion, and it happens again in the 1860s and 70s with the Lakota and the Sioux nations out in the West. But it's never again at the kind of size and influence that Tecumseh's Confederacy was. So it's never really another kind of existential threat. Americans, for the most part, even a lot of Americans who opposed it, figured that we're destined to just sweep them out of the way. And this later becomes kind of mythologized as this idea of manifest destiny, which during 1812 was an idea. It was the kind of the seed of an idea. It wasn't really something that anybody had put pen to paper with yet, but everybody kind of assumed. We're a more advanced nation, if you believe in their tiers of advancement. There's no way that they can last. And by the end of the 19th century, they have this idea of the disappearing race. There's a joke from some Navajo reservations from the 1920s saying that, in every Navajo house, there's, the grandmother and the grandfather, there's the young family and their kids, and their resident anthropologist who's studying the Navajo to make sure that they can, preserve this culture before it disappears from the earth forever. And in reality, when you actually look at, especially here in Michigan, the Odawa after the War of 1812 actually had a very long, very successful legacy in avoiding being essentially kind of uprooted and shoved out to the west like a lot of other Native American tribes had. So actually the first big lumber industry in Michigan was Odawa owned and Odawa operated. The first big fisheries that were plying up and down the Great Lakes were Odawa owned and operated. And so they were actually very, very successful in avoiding that kind of, terrible fate that most of the other Native Americans in the country had, mostly because Michigan was a little bit north of the pressures of advancing west. So that settlement creep didn't really kind of find its way up here until about the 1860s. But the Republicans, Thomas Jefferson's legacy, can thank the fact that we won the War of 1812, because if we had lost, or if we had to negotiate an unfair truce with the British, the Republican leadership would have been ousted instantly. It would have probably led to kind of a resurgence of the idea of federalism, this idea that the more powerful a federal government we have, the better it is for everybody. And obviously not everybody agreed with that, and most people thought that before the War of 1812, the Federalist Party was on its last gasp, last attempt to kind of keep its former credibility that it had under John Adams. But this leads to what's called the era of good feelings, which I think is one of the most inappropriately named periods in American history. But everybody acted like everybody was on the same side, at least for a while. And then a guy named Andrew Jackson came along and ruined that too. So, but by 1823, we have a court case. It's called Johnson versus McIntosh. And this is a court case that is brought up to the Supreme Court, and it's all about land entitlement, land claims. And it's asking the question whether or not an American citizen can legally purchase land from Native Americans. The answer comes down from the Supreme Court. It says no. And the reason it says no is because, for one thing, they want the federal government to control who parcels out the land. It's much better for the people that are profiting off of the kind of land flipping that they're getting into. Actually, most of the presidents, with the exception of the Adamses, most of them became rich from essentially buying cheap Indian land and selling it at great profit, including Andrew Jackson. He was a master of that. But it basically says that no private citizen can purchase land from the Native Americans, and another reason for this is because they don't want people going around conflicting with these treaties that they're trying to get signed. So if I go out and buy land from some guy, I say it was an Odawa, he says he definitely owns this land, it kind of interferes when we're trying to make the Odawa Nation, something we invented, sign a treaty that says that you own this much land, we're getting this much land. It conflicts with basically the idea of expanding westward peacefully. The same year, we have the Monroe Doctrine. So James Monroe becomes the president that follows up James Madison. And the Monroe Doctrine essentially says that this hemisphere of the world, North America, South America, is under American hegemony. So no British need apply. We will not tolerate any colonialism up north and South America anymore, under penalty of going to war with the United States. And for the most part, everybody in Europe is so busy with Europe that they don't really care. So it's not because they're scared of fighting with us, but they realize that fighting in North America is expensive. It's very, very costly in lives. It's aggravating, and it's something it's basically like buying a boat. It's a money hole. You just keep pitching money at it, and nothing good ever seems to come out of it. So most of Europe is pretty content to just leave everybody alone, at least here in North America. And this kind of sets the stage for this idea of the manifest destiny. And I don't believe personally that that idea would have been as solidly entrenched in kind of the American idea if we hadn't had the War of 1812 that we had. You know, again, we're at a point where we could have easily lost the war if the wind had stayed in a different direction on one of the days of battles. You know, these are battles that are decided on a coin flip more than anything else. So it's not American strength of arms. It's not American shrewd politics. It's a mistake of a war at its start that just sort of happens to accidentally land in more or less our favor. So remember, we're fighting for Canada. We didn't succeed in capturing Canada. I don't know if you folks knew that. But it was a failure at pretty much every level to capture Canada. We succeeded in ending impressment only because the Napoleonic Wars had ended before we signed the Treaty of Ghent. That was one of the reasons the British actually felt comfortable signing it, because they no longer had an enemy to fight. And the Americans were realizing, well, if they bring over all their Napoleonic veterans, we're doomed. So we better sign a treaty quick. Those orders in council, the blockade of mainland Europe had actually been repealed about a week before we declared war on the British. So most of the initial reasons that we had to go to war were completely moot or circumvented by the time we actually ended the war. They actually never mentioned impressment in the treaty at all, because both sides figured, well, they don't need to impress American sailors anymore, so we'll just forget about it. We'll just end the war here. So it's kind of it's a difficult legacy, but this does lead to Indian removal. It does lead to the next several decades of American policy, which is all based on this kind of accidental victory. And again, if things had been decided a little bit differently, it's a bit of counterfactual argument to make, but I believe we probably would have had a very, very different United States at this point. And so, you know, a lot of people don't really think the War of 1812 is all that important, especially because we've got these two great big black holes in American history. We've got the Revolution about 30 years before, and we've got the Civil War about 40 years after that kind of suck up all the, everybody's efforts in history. I was actually talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago, and I told them what my thesis is about, which is about the militia in the War of 1812. And he's like, oh, I'm really happy you didn't say the Civil War, because everything about the Civil War has been said, you know. But it is, you know, obviously this kind of sets the stage for some of what happens in the Civil War. This idea of states' rights or federal rights or individual rights or states' rights are very clearly, they have not been dealt with by the war. We actually have the very first effort that was ever made to secede from the United States actually happened during the War of 1812, is at the Hartford Convention. It was the northern states were actually deciding whether or not they should secede from the Union and make a separate peace with Great Britain because of the ruin of the War of 1812. Most of the people didn't take it very seriously. They didn't think they were going to secede, but the idea was talked about. And this actually terrified James Madison because he didn't want to be the president that oversaw the ruin of the nation, of disunion. That would have been a great big tarnish of his legacy. So it didn't happen that way, but it could have. You know, if the war had gone on for another year or so, if they had been able to bring their Napoleonic veterans over, it would have been a very different ending of the war.
How does this war match up with what's going on in Europe when did Waterloo take place?
Waterloo took place in 1815. That was during what was called the 100 Days. The 100 Days, basically Napoleon, when he was first defeated in 1814, was packed off to Elba Island. He escaped from Elba Island, he basically walked up to the first French fort he could find, and when the guards were pointing their muskets at him, he said, like, are you going to kill your emperor? And the guy apparently dropped his musket and passed out, and everybody joined Napoleon. There's actually a really great movie called Waterloo that was made in the 70s, I believe, that basically compresses every single famous thing that either Napoleon or the British guy... Wellington, thank you. Every single famous thing that they said, apparently they said during the 100 Days. And this is the second attempt of Napoleon to kind of bring up his army and defeat this coalition and take power again. But obviously it ended in failure. But that was about a year or so after the war ended.
How does Trafalgar fit into this?
Trafalgar was a naval battle in, I'm not sure the year, but that was basically ruined the French fleet. It ended any possibility of the French fighting at even odds with the British again. And so Trafalgar...
For the British Navy to make more...
Yes,
over the US?
definitely. Yes, yeah. And that was one of the big reasons that they could actually afford to haul all of their ships, you know, back to the United States to blockade all of our ports. Because one thing we had probably too many of were ports. Because we had that entire East Coast. Just every little cove, every little shallow or deep water area could have ships in it that could go out. So yeah, I mean, if I were to give a narrative of, you know, the major beats of the Napoleonic Wars and the major beats of the War of 1812, they follow about 6 months after. The British are able to mobilize these great big troop numbers, and actually all the guys that were at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815 were Napoleonic War veterans. They were actually under the command of Wellington's brother-in-law. He was actually killed at the Battle of New Orleans, but these are Napoleonic veterans. This was one of the big reasons it became such kind of a popular victory, was because these were the best of the best that the British could send. These were veterans from the Peninsular War, fighting in Spain against the best French forces they could find, and the Americans kicked the tar out of them. At least that's the story. So that's one of the major reasons that as soon as we found out that the Napoleonic Wars were over, everybody at Ghent was like, well, we better end something now. We better get it ended.
Well, why don't we wrap this up? And you got any, more questions that the gentleman can answer here? I think he's really covered the subject. And yeah.
I have an unfair question.
Yeah.
Why do you suppose this is fascinating? Why did this never capture the public imagination?
Well,
we just went through a bicentennial, for crying out loud.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I think a lot of it is because, again, as one of my history professors talks about the black holes of American history, I think there is so much effort that's expended at the Civil War that it kind of over branches everything. I mean, we got some pretty good responses when we did our tours and everything at Mackinac, and for the most part, people were saying, well, I never knew anything about that. That's fascinating. But, it's just kind of one of these goofy little wars, and it's not very flattering, for one thing. You can study a lot of things about the Civil War, and no matter what side you agree with, there's a lot of flattering stuff in there. There's a lot of great commanders, great leaders, and this is pretty much a war of accidents. So it's not very flattering. If you've had an entire life of a flattering idea of American history, this is something that might be kind of difficult at first to wrap your head around, because it's not something that I was reading a book the other day. The introduction actually introduced, it says, America is the land of Jefferson. And, I study Jefferson from the War of 1812 standpoint, and the guy he single-handedly started the war, practically. He did not have a very good administration. It's just this legacy that I think is part of the War of 1812 comes out of it. And so it's a complicated legacy. It's a complicated story. It's not as easy as saying taxes started the Revolutionary War and slavery started the Civil War. You have to kind of dive in and get about 15 minutes of lecture about what the causes were.
I was taught they impressed our sailors, and we weren't going to have any of that.
Right, yeah. And that's the simplest answer, because it was that was definitely a cause of the war. And even Federalists who opposed the war, again, were talking about a limited naval engagement to address just those grievances. But then we also have Canada, and yeah. So, any other questions? Yes, sir?
I once read, I'm not sure it's true, that after the burning of Washington, the British troops on the withdrawal were struck by one of the greatest storms in American history.
Yes, that absolutely happened. That was yes, there was a storm that actually hit the British troops right after they had sacked Washington, and that absolutely did happen. They were trying to retreat. This was one of the reasons that they couldn't actually press up to Baltimore like they had planned. And yeah, it was actually one of the biggest kind of hurricanes to hit the East Coast in American history. And these are again guys that are stuck out in tents. They burned the city down, so they couldn't exactly go back into the houses. But this is again one of the best books I've actually read about this is called the Gods of Prophetstown, and it talks about the kind of religious awakening of the Native Americans and kind of the sort of American perspective on religion at the time, because obviously a lot of the founding fathers, if you like that term, I don't really, but a lot of the early American politicians, let's say, were what's called deists. They believed not really. It's kind of a non-denominational sort of Christian type idea, and it mostly means that God or this providential figure, whatever you want to call it, kind of determines the course of events. And so if you study the War of 1812, it seems like definitely that happens. The wind changes direction just when we need it. The storm hits the British just after they burned down Washington. And there's a lot of people that really believe this stuff, that God is literally on our side. But and again, this kind of legacy gets brought back up about 20 years later when all of these War of 1812 veterans are running for president. They've got these legacies, and they're saying, look, I was on the field when Tecumseh died. God's on my side. Vote for me. So that kind of thing is going up, and actually the memory of the War of 1812 in kind of the American political establishment 20, 30, 40 years later is equally fascinating in my opinion, but I'd need another couple of hours to cover all that. So
I think you got a question over here.
Yes, sir.
You had mentioned earlier, referencing Tecumseh as the prophet, And building on this point you said, in the spirituality and the religion of the area at the time, not only had taken advantage of being able to predict so-called lunar eclipses and terrorizing people.
Yes.
I've had historians, but I have not seen really good reference of it. One of the reasons that Fort Detroit went down so quick on the first round is they virtually abandoned it because of the New Madrid earthquake and association that he had predicted it.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely, it's something that, a lot of historians try to desensationalize everything, right? So not a lot of historians are really kind of bold enough to say like, oh, this was definitely a reason. But, the more you kind of immerse yourself in this period, the more you realize that people were very spiritual. Whether they were Christian, is a different argument. But they believed in things like this. And so when you say that, the prophet predicted an eclipse, you can also say, well, Poor Richard's Almanac also predicts an eclipse. Like, that's not that important. But when you do have these events that are happening at seemingly, very close together, they seem to be related, that's a major influence in people's decision-making at the time. So I can't speak especially to whether or not that influenced Hull, but I do know that is definitely something that doesn't get as much examination as I think it deserves. Yes, sir?
The River Raisin, I believe, is a state park down there now. Talking to a gentleman Monday said that it was not long ago that they widened the road to the state park and uncovered 20 more bodies.
Yeah, that's actually a national park now. Yeah, it got turned into a national park, I believe, 3 or 4 years ago. So I actually had an internship with them last year. And I was actually studying the Odawa in the War of 1812.
How long ago was that road widened?
When it was, I don't know. I can't say.
I can help you out with that, is what they did is build a bike/walking path that completed from the state park all the way up into the River Raisin Battlefield, which is the national park, which is on the Raisin River right by the expressway, and Detroit Avenue and Elm Avenue. And when they were excavating all of that, when they found all these other bodies.
Well, let me thank him very much for coming here tonight and